Today's lesson is going to be on major concepts of the Constitution. I'm going to do my best to break it down for you. Very few Americans have actually read through the entire Constitution, and this may be in large part due to the language that might be very difficult to understand. Most Americans are, however, familiar with the preamble to the Constitution. Let's go ahead and break this down. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. There are several ideals that are included in this introduction to the Constitution. Let's take on the first one, a more perfect union. The framers knew they couldn't create a perfect government, so what they tried to establish was a government that was more perfect than the previous government under the Articles of Confederation. The next part, establishing justice, meaning fairness under the law. Next, ensuring domestic tranquility, meaning maintaining peace. Providing for the common defense, meaning protecting citizens both domestically and from foreign enemies. Promoting the general welfare, meaning looking out for the general well-being of the citizens. The next part, securing the blessings of liberty, is a commitment to limited government. And extending it to posterity means we're securing it for future generations. This preamble helps us understand what the Constitution sought to achieve. It also helps us to understand what some of the basic principles of the Constitution are. Let's take a look at the outline of the Constitution. We already discussed the first part, which is the preamble, stating the purpose of the Constitution. Article 1 goes over the structure of the legislative branch. Article 2 goes over the executive branch. Article 3, the judicial branch. Article 4, relations among states. Article 5, amending the Constitution. Article 6, national debts, supremacy of national law, and oaths of office. And Article 7 deals with ratifying the Constitution. Let's review the 6 basic principles of the Constitution. The first principle is popular sovereignty. This asserts that the people are the source of any and all power, and government can exist only with the consent of the governed. This connects to foundational ideals, consent of the governed, as well as social contract. The second principle is limited government. And limited government states that government is restricted in what it can do. And each individual has rights that the government can't take away. These rights are more specifically known as civil liberties. These civil liberties are more specifically laid out in the Bill of Rights. The third principle is the separation of powers. This is the principle in which the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government are 3 independent and co-equal branches of government. The fourth principle is checks and balances. This is a system that allows the legislative, executive, and judicial branches to check or restrain the actions of one another. Important to know the difference between separation of powers and checks and balances. There are powers laid out in the Constitution that belong to each of these branches. There are also ways in which each of these branches can limit the power of the other branches. The limitation component is a key aspect of checks and balances. The fifth principle is judicial review, and this consists of the power of a court to determine the constitutionality of a governmental action. This gives the courts the power to interpret the law. The sixth principle is federalism, and this is a system of government in which the powers of government are divided between a central government and local government. In this case, we're talking about the national government versus the state government. Let's take some time to discuss the difference between the separation of powers and checks and balances. When we look at the separation of powers, we're looking at all the power that's delegated to each of these branches within the Constitution. The legislative branch, also known as Congress, passes laws, and they've got a unique set of powers. They lay and collect taxes, borrow money, regulate trade, which is connected to the Commerce Clause, makes the national currency, establishes rules on citizenship, creates lower federal courts, declares war. Misconception that a lot of people have is that the commander-in-chief or the president gets to declare war. Technically, a formal declaration of war can only be made by Congress. They raise and train U.S. military forces, govern the District of Columbia, control the appropriation of money, and they can also make their own laws in which they conduct their day-to-day business. The next branch is the executive branch. This includes the president. In addition to the president, although it's not pictured here, is the president's cabinet, which includes all of the secretaries, as well as the bureaucracy, all the agencies that are necessary to carry out the execution of the laws. The executive branch is a unique set of powers, including being commander-in-chief, which means being the head of the military, making treaties with foreign nations, essentially being the chief diplomat, making appointments, including judges and foreign ambassadors, keeping Congress informed about the state of the nation by giving the State of the Union, recommending laws, also known as proposing laws, calling Congress into special sessions, receiving ambassadors from other countries, again connected to being the chief diplomat, and seeing the laws are enforced, so providing directives to the bureaucratic agencies, for example. The judicial branch includes the Supreme Court and other federal courts, and their job is to interpret the law. Their unique powers include hearing cases involving the laws of the United States, treaties, and controversies between the states. The Supreme Court mostly hears appeals cases, but they also take on some original jurisdiction cases. And a person accused of a crime will have a jury trial. Checks and balances is a separate principle, but it can still go hand in hand with the separation of powers. Checks and balances deals with the power play between branches, looking into how one branch can limit the powers of the other two. These checks are put in place not just to limit the power of each of the branches, but to limit the power of the federal government as a whole. Let's look at how the executive branch can limit the power of both the legislative branch and the judicial branch. The president can propose laws, veto laws, call special sessions of Congress, make appointments, and negotiate foreign treaties. When it comes to the judicial branch, the executive branch can appoint federal judges and can grant pardons to federal offenders. Taking a look at the legislative branch, they can check the executive by overriding the president's veto, confirming executive appointments, ratifying treaties, declaring war, appropriating money, and possibly impeaching or removing the president. Legislative checks on the judicial branch include creating lower federal courts, impeaching and removing judges so they have the same power doing it in that branch as well. They can propose amendments to overrule judicial decisions, and they can approve appointments of federal judges. The judicial branch can limit the power of both the executive and the legislative. They can declare executive actions unconstitutional, and they can declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. We see checks and balances play out every day, and we often get really frustrated because we see that these checks and balances built into the Constitution can create stall and inefficiency when it comes to the federal government. However, it is very important to note that these checks and balances were built into government to ensure that the federal government didn't pass laws too quickly. What complicates checks and balances even more is the overlap of power play between political parties that make up these branches. Now let's talk about federalism. Federalism includes the power of the national government as well as the power of the state government. Although these powers are divided, there are also some powers that are shared between the national and state government. Originally, the national government had powers it had sovereignty over, and the state government had powers it had sovereignty over. And so the powers that they had were distinctive and divided. This was known as dual federalism, meaning there were distinct differences in the powers that the national government had and the state government had, and they had sovereignty over their own affairs. Later, however, dual federalism became cooperative federalism, meaning that the national government and state government had to cooperate more so with each other to implement certain types of programs. This became popularized after FDR implemented the New Deal, and there were many federal programs that the states had to cooperate in implementing. Let's take a look at the powers of the national government. The national government can declare war, maintain armed forces, regulate interstate and foreign trade, admit new states, establish post offices, set standard weights and measures, coin money, establish foreign policy, make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out the delegated powers. Under the state government, they can establish and maintain schools, establish local governments, regulate business within the state, make marriage laws, provide for public safety, assume other powers not delegated to the national government or prohibited to the states. And they can also control alcoholic beverages. So the two main things that we want to really pick up on here would include the necessary and proper clause underneath making all laws necessary and proper for carrying out the delegated powers, and under the state, assume other powers not delegated to the national government or prohibited to the states, which is essentially laid out in the 10th Amendment, also known as reserved power. Lastly, let's take a look at the powers that both the national and state governments share. They can both maintain law and order. They both levy taxes, both borrow money, both can charter banks, both can establish courts, and both provide for the public welfare. This shared power can often be at the center of conflict between the national government and the state government. They don't always agree, and it becomes even harder when a state government's administration is of a different political party than that of the national government's administration. Now let's talk about the formal amendment process, meaning the way in which the Constitution can either be changed or something can be added to it. There are technically 4 ways in which the Constitution can be amended. Only 2 have been used, and only one of those 2 has been used once. This is a 2-step process. Let's take a look at the primary way that amendments have been ratified. The first is the proposal process. So an amendment must be proposed by Congress with a 2/3 vote in both houses. Then, if it gets that far, it gets sent to the states, and the state legislatures have to vote on it. 3/4 or 38 out of the 50 states have to agree to ratifying the amendment. The second way to amend the Constitution was only done once, and it was in regard to the 21st Amendment. This repealed the 18th Amendment, dealing with prohibition of alcohol. In this case, Congress proposed the amendment with a 2/3 vote in both houses, and instead of it getting sent to state legislatures, it was ratified by conventions held in 3/4 of the states. The third process has never been done before, but technically a proposal can happen at a national convention called by Congress when requested by 2/3 of state legislatures. Then it can be ratified by conventions held in 3/4 of the states. It can also be proposed at a national convention called by Congress and requested by 2/3 of state legislatures, and then sent to state legislatures for a 3/4 vote to ratify. It's nice to know the 4 ways in which the Constitution can be amended, but rarely will you be asked about all 4 of these possibilities. Typically, if you can remember the jingle, 2/3 of both houses, 3/4 of all states, that is a way you can remember the amendment process. It is very important not to get the amendment process confused with how a bill becomes a law, because the numbers are very different. In order to pass a bill or for a bill to become law, you need a majority of both houses of Congress with an approval by the president. We'll talk about that more in our 3rd unit.
As of right now, this is the end of the lesson.